Well, let's bring in a researcher and economist at the Institute for Economic Justice, Busi Sibeko, to give us her thoughts on what we heard today. Busi, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Let's start by just getting your thoughts on what the Finance Minister said today. There weren't a lot of expectations on his first speech, although some were saying this was going to be an opportunity for him to set the stage for his finance term as Finance Minister.
Absolutely, and I think the key message that we will continue on the status quo, unfortunately. That was his first speech. It said that the fiscal strategy remains unchanged from the supplementary budget in 2020. And of course, with this regard, we're deeply concerned because it's over a year into the crisis, and how can we still be following a strategy that was implemented at the beginning of the crisis? What have we learned over the year from local and global, experiences about what needs to happen and what kind of rescue and therefore recovery we need to be planning for and working towards?
But the medium-term budget statement, I mean, in all fairness, it is not normally one where big things happen. It's normally an assessment at the halfway mark, and you sit with your players and you discuss strategy for the second half of the match, right? And normally it's just changing a few things, and then it gets you to the budget in February. Wasn't that what happened today?
I mean, not really. I think one critical difference between the budget earlier this year and now is that we've got increased fiscal space, right? So we know that because of surge in growth due to favorable commodity prices meant that we had better than expected tax returns. We know that we've had an increase in allocations of special drawing rights. So in terms of fiscal space, there was more space to actually make radical decisions, right? To say that this is how we want to pave the way for recovery. And of course, we would have wanted to hear, for example, a proposal for universal basic income grant, even if it wasn't necessarily fully fledged out now, but the intention to extend social protection beyond February 2022. And all we got was that, look, if there's money in 2022, then we'll consider, increasing expenditure on the presidential employment stimulus plan. If there's money, we'll consider extended social protection. Yes, we've considered an extended child grant for children who've been doubly orphaned, but we're not going to implement it now. And of course, people need these measures now, some of them, right? We need job creation and protection measures now because the crisis is ongoing and there's a fourth wave anticipated in early December. And so in a way, we expected that there would be a change as opposed to the status quo and national treasury or government, as they've wanted us to speak of them as, instead of them saying, look, you'll find out in February what we actually want to do.
Isn't it better to err on the side of caution, maybe? I mean, you make bold statements and then come February, things have turned upside down and then you renege and then you get custard pies thrown at you.
I mean, of course, being cautionary is, good at times, but really this strategy is lukewarm at best, right? You'd rather have a decisive, what is needed during a crisis is a decisive state that says this is the way that we're going to move forward. And I don't think that this budget in itself sparked much confidence from broader society. Yes, it might sound good to, the supposed investors that we're trying to gain confidence from, but it has not sparked broader, confidence. And I think that is something critical because civil society in particular has been coming time and time again with alternatives, and we're feeling as though we're not being heard, right? We are saying these are the measures that are needed. And in fact, this budget doesn't reflect those goals from civil society itself and broader society. So I think, that is the main thing. We understand that there's great uncertainty in this context. And so it's understandable that they would rather, err on the side of caution. But at the same time, we've got almost 30 billion in the third year of unallocated reserves. And so then the question is, if those reserves, if they don't think they'll materialize, why are they in the budget to begin with? If they believe they'll materialize, why aren't they utilizing them towards really expanding social protection, investing in jobs and creation and protection, investing in businesses, especially SMMEs, and investing in the sectors that are quite vulnerable currently, and investing in people, education, health, and so forth, which have been significantly disinvested from. I mean, health alone is going to, decrease by a negative 0.6% in the medium term. And that is in nominal terms, not even in real terms. So we haven't taken into account inflation. We haven't taken into account medical price inflation, which is higher than normal inflation. And so, we really are underwhelmed by this budget itself.
So you talked about social protection, this 350 Rand social distress grant. It's going to run until February. Do you think that it needs to push on beyond? And should we be talking about deeper grants, basic income grants kicking in as early as March next year?
Absolutely. In fact, with those unallocated reserves today, what would have been ideal to hear is that the 350 Rand will be expanded to at least the food poverty line, which is now above 600 Rand, according to Statistics South Africa. And so in March, the expectation, or what we would call for and continuously call for, is an expansion of social protection in the form of a universal basic income grant, which would basically cater for the 18 to 59 age group, which have been traditionally excluded from social protection. Of course, our constitution is clear. People have the right to social assistance, and this is not people under 18 or people over 59 only. It is, people in South Africa have the right to social assistance. And of course, there's been a long-standing gap in this area. But also we're in a crisis, right? High levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, and inequality. And in fact, I wouldn't even call it a crisis. I don't think it's right to call it a crisis anymore. It's an ongoing pandemic because it's not a sudden factor in our economy. It's always been there. But to say, how do we adequately respond to those people's need in the current? And of course, a universal basic income grant is not a silver bullet. What we fundamentally need is a rethinking of the whole macroeconomic framework in such a way that it would generate jobs in particular. And, I'd argue that the current approaches, the fiscal approach currently, is going to retard growth. And even though we're seeing this growth in the first part of the year, it's commodities driven. And we need to think about the quality of growth that we need in our economy, which has to address the structural, demands of unemployment in our country. And so, of course, universal basic income grant is much needed, but at the same time, it's not going to solve all of South Africa's problems overnight, and basic services will still be needed. And you can see in this budget that there's significant disinvestment from basic services themselves.
All right. I mean, it's a really difficult job being a finance minister, because if you just look at the numbers, it's easy and you've got certain income coming through and you can only spend what you earn. So we've got this massive budget deficit that he has to start addressing. And you talked about this reserves and so on and so forth. Is that not something that we should be prioritizing as well? Because you can't continue to have these massive debt burdens on the country's neck. And then, of course, we've got 43 municipalities that are in distress, that are going to need to be bailed out.
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, I think it is critical that we are reminded that a national fiscus, or the national budget, is not like a household budget. And therefore, these, likenings that you can't spend more than what you have and so forth do not really play the same role in a national fiscus as they do in your household fiscus. But also there's many ways of tackling, debt or debt servicing. And our government has chosen to pursue a surplus. And in fact, even the International Monetary Fund, which our government usually listens to, has said this is not the time to be pursuing a budget surplus. In fact, what the IMF proposes is that growth should reduce the debt to GDP ratio over time. So that's the second option for, dealing with debt. And then the third option is to really look at monetary policy tools. And in fact, in the budget, they acknowledge that interest rates are quite high, right? The cost of borrowing in South Africa is quite high. And so the question is, what monetary tools can we utilize? What is South African Reserve Bank doing? And what kind of policies can reduce the cost of borrowing? And I don't think we've adequately engaged with that. In fact, the budget doesn't adequately engage with that. And so there's ways of tackling debt to GDP without pursuing a surplus, which would be deeply detrimental, not only to our economy, but to our socioeconomic status, right, to socioeconomic rights. And in fact, the violent protests earlier this year are only indication of what could happen with continued disinvestment in basic services and the people of this country. I think the budget deeply underestimates the political and social risks that are associated. And in terms of municipalities, I think, the budget rightly points out that this remains a critical risk. But again, the budget doesn't really respond to the risk, right? So in the budget, we've got SOEs are a risk, but then there'll be no bailouts. Municipalities are a risk, but we'll just, increase some expenditure to them. And so I feel like this budget, in a way, as much as it outlines the risks of Eskom, of lack of infrastructure, of all these things, it doesn't actually respond to how it will mitigate these risks, which is, again, a failure of decisive response to what is needed. You can talk about the problem all you want, but what are the solutions directly responding to the problems that you've identified? And of course, from my end, I would identify the problems a bit differently, but that's not the point. The point is that budget is explicit in the things that they see as risks, but at the same time is not responding to those risks and how it will mitigate them.
So what do we do with our beloved parastatals? Because they are also bleeding money, and the taxpayers continue to bail them out.
I mean, it's a tricky question. I think it always goes back to this question of, the role of the state and what is the role of state-owned entities and what are the strategic reasons why they exist. And going back to why does it exist? Why is electricity provisioning a state-owned entity instead of private provisioning, right? And to understand that there are public goods that cannot be rolled out through the private sector because the private sector is compelled by high profits. And so it is critical that we have public services, basic goods, right? Goods and services. And so we really have to save some of these or most of these SOEs, but it goes back to what is the developmental agenda. And also to remind people that, state-owned entities weren't designed for hyper profitability. We should be happy if our state-owned entities are breaking even and doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so it is critical to really rethink state-owned entities and the role of the state fundamentally, and to adequately address the issues, because I think sometimes there's non-solutions to some of these issues that the state-owned entities themselves are facing. So we really need to be honest about what are the issues and how do we address them? And they're not just financial issues, as we all know. Some of them are management issues. Some of them are corruption issues. Some of them are just, there are many, many issues. And I think this is where the state really needs to say to social partners, help us resolve this. And in fact, across the board, I think increased participation has to be the norm. Even with the budget itself, we've been proposing alternatives for ages, and our voices are not being heard, or we believe they're not being heard because we're not seeing any changes. And I think there's certainly scope there to have more social partner engagement on how to decisively resolve some of these issues.
Right. The last question, public service wages. I remember working for Transnet during the apartheid era. And one of the things that I saw was that these entities were just there to create jobs, particularly for white minorities, and that's what it did. The Transnets of this world. And I wonder if we haven't carried on with the same kind of attitude, and that we have too many civil servants. Our public sector wage bill is too big, and at some point it does get to a point where everything snaps.
I mean, the public sector wage bill has been deeply debated. And of course, like your Transnet Escoms are not, a part of that public sector wage bill, right? And so in terms of the public sector wage bill itself, what National Treasury has done in the next year is that they've penned in or penciled in 20.5 billion. And this is meant to be sort of like a bailout clause or a contingency plan, depending on the outcomes of the legal proceedings that are going to be ongoing. And so, you know, the public sector wage bill hasn't significantly increased, as people have, you know, like to point out. You know, our country has massive needs. And, you know, the other day, Matthew Parks was talking about the ratio of public servants between 1994 and now. You know, the number of public workers to the population has actually declined over time. We've got massive needs. Our population is growing. We've got thousands of vacancies in various sectors. You know, KZN alone will be retrenching 4,000 teachers because of the budget cuts. They already had 2,000 vacancies in the province itself. And so it's about what is our public sector wage bill trying to deliver? You know, that's how we should be approaching it. What is needed in our, you know, for us to fully deliver human rights? You know, what is needed and how will we deliver that ultimately, as opposed to saying there's too many people. But those people are, you know, they have functions, and that is to deliver the Constitution.
But Busi,
so, I mean,
Busi, you go to some of these government departments and there are managers of managers who are reporting to managers of managers.
I mean, you know, the structures and stuff are things. I was going to say that I think the structures of who's needed and what is needed are things that we can engage in, and the equity within the wage bill itself, like how much are people earning at the top end versus the bottom end, are conversations that certainly need to take place. But I don't think the starting point should be the wage bill is too large, because that is not necessarily the problem.
All right. Okay. I'm going to vote for you for Finance Minister next, so get ready. Busi, it's always great talking to you. Thanks so much.
I'm too young for this.
That's Busi Sibeko talking to us about the Finance Minister's medium-term budget and, mixed reactions. But I suppose one can see it as erring on the side of caution, and people saying that with some reserves, he could have done more. All right, so we're going to take a